Hi there. So, as you know now, I've written a book, one more, the Nordic Baking Book. And it's the kind of the culmination of a 6-year-long research process that produced the Nordic Cookbook after 3 years and that now finishes with this. And it's been a really amazing thing to get to do this, to get to research and learn so much about my own food culture, a food culture that I thought I knew a lot about, and that I was presumably also choosing to write these books about, since I should have known quite a lot about, but that it turned out that I knew actually very little of how much diversity that was out there. The goal with these books is really to sort of explain what Nordic food culture is. Because I think that the Nordic food culture is one of the most misunderstood food cultures on the planet. And this is probably because there's just not that much information out there. You know, if you type Nordic cooking into Google, or Nordic food culture or something like that, you'll get 1,000 articles about Noma and Favik and like a handful of other very ambitious contemporary restaurants, none of which really has very much to do with what people eat in their homes. And aside that, you'll get a whole bunch of recipes for gravlax and meatballs, herring. And then if you picture Google, you'll also get a lot of people photographing their meatball portions at IKEA. And none of these things are very indicative of what people eat on an everyday basis in the Nordics either. So I really felt that there was a need for these books. And something that I discovered during, especially the second half of this process, when I worked more intensely with the baking part of the duo, is that there's just, I mean, when you start comparing, I'm completely convinced that the Nordic baking culture is the greatest baking culture on the planet today. I haven't been able to find any other baking cultures that's as diverse and that's as deeply rooted in the sort of common culture anywhere else. And this might sound like a little bit less than obvious to most people. I mean, it wouldn't be like the French or the Italians, or, you know, there's a whole bunch of other great baking cultures out there as well. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now making my case as to why I think that the Nordic baking culture really is the greatest out there. And then I thought that we can do that for about half an hour and then finish with some questions. And the best place to start when you're talking about culture, it's the people. So without people, there is no culture, baking or any other for that matter. And the Nordic region, it's inhabited by about 26 million people, and they are spread out over a surface area of 3.5 million square kilometers. And that's not particularly densely populated. It's actually an average of about 7.5 person per square kilometer. And this is interesting to start comparing because it really has a bearing on how food culture develops. And if we look at the whole rest of Europe, after having removed the Nordics and the people living there, the whole rest of Europe would have about 90 people per square kilometer, a lot more. And it's even more interesting to go in and look at specific countries. I mean, France, 116 people per square kilometer, and Germany, which is, the most populous country in Europe, has 237 persons per square kilometer living in it. And that means that if you take all of these Germans and you spread them out in an even layer over the whole surface of the country, right? They will be standing 75 meters apart from each other in an even layer. And that's not particularly far. In the Nordics, if you were to do exactly the same thing, it would be 375 meters. That's far. That's not even shouting distance. So we have this vast geographical area with a very sparse population. And if we were to go back in time a little bit, let's say a couple of hundred years, to a time when a lot of what we consider our cultural identity of today was actually founded, what do you guys think that this sparsity of population would have meant for how knowledge was transmitted between people? Can I get some suggestions? Don't be shy now. You have to think like pre-television, cell phone, social media. You don't have to raise your hand, you can just talk straight up, it's fine.
I guess it moved quite slowly.
Yes.
Depending if you went 365 years, how many times a year you did it, or...
Yeah, definitely. I think that's like the essence of this thing actually, is that information everywhere was transmitted at a much lower pace back then than it is today. I mean, you essentially had to talk directly to a person to inquire or to acquire whatever information they might have had, or write a letter and mail it, which is not exactly a particularly efficient way of dealing with lots of information. Or, I mean, if you wanted to just learn from a more central source, you could also read a book. But back then there were like 3 books, and one was the Bible, and then there were 2 more, and they didn't deal with baking either. So that wasn't really a great option for learning about baking culture. So if we agree then that information flowed slower everywhere because of the lack of technology, we can also very easily imagine that in an era or in an area as scarcely populated as the Nordic region, this effect would have been even further exaggerated. And this is very important for my reasoning, and it's something that I will come back to a little bit later. Now we're going to take an example. So, if you there, yes, you. Tomorrow you will invent a new cake recipe. And it's the most delicious cake recipe ever invented in the history of humankind. It's like the cake recipe, like the mother of cake recipes. It's like the cake recipe that all bakers wish that they would have invented. And you make this cake, and you're really happy with yourself, as we are when we make a delicious cake. Your family, they're also really, really happy because they get to eat the cake. And the cake, gets shared on social media, because that's what we do these days when we're happy with ourselves. We're really proud of something, we share it through social media or other wells. And it reaches a few more people pretty quickly. And perhaps even some of those feel that this is a credible source, credible enough on baking. So they get the recipe, and they also bake it, and they do the same thing. They get really excited about this because it's, after all, also the most delicious cake ever invented. So I mean, they will be excited, and they share it even further. And it continues like this for a couple of more sort of social media generations, which are really short, maybe just a couple of hours. And then you get someone with some serious reach, and you reach 10,000 or 100,000 people, and before you know it, the cake recipe that you invented is featured on Martha Stewart Living. That's how it goes. And after that, 1 week later, it's my birthday, and Tove, my wife, who's also done a lot of the recipe development for this book, she makes birthday cake, but it's not the one that I usually get, which is the green marzipan layer cake, the princess cake, my absolute favorite birthday cake. Oh no, it's a new one. But it's not yours, actually. It's the vegan raw food version that she got from her Goop newsletter. And that's sort of how information flows these days. And it's very interesting because not only does it reach many, many more people very quickly, it also reaches a huge area. And it mutates really quickly. It changes really quickly. And I mean, if you compare this to how it used to work, like back in the old days, you would have invented the cake, be really happy with itself. The family would have been really happy with your cake as well. And that would have been it, for probably a very long time. Because you didn't leave the farm very often, and when you did, you probably didn't bring cake. So it was there. And maybe the first time that cake would have gotten slightly wider distribution in terms of the information around it would have been when someone left the farm, perhaps a son or a daughter moved and got married on the neighboring farm, and brought the cake recipe with them, baked it, got happy, shared it with the family, also got happy, and then like 20 years later you would have reached all of like 2 kilometers and 8 people. I mean, this is sort of a slight over exaggeration, but I think that you get the point. And to put it very simply, a scarce population spread out over a vast area used to mean, and to some extent still does mean, that knowledge travels slower. And this in its turn, it will always mean that you get a more varied expression of all commonly practiced culture. And this is simply because people are less influenced by each other and therefore do less of the same stuff. And this is one of the big reasons to why the Nordic region has a much more diverse baking culture than many other places in the world. Another reason for this, which is also somewhat related to the scarcity of population and which really influences the baking culture, it's bakeries and their sort of role in society. And in the Nordics, baking culture is not carried out primarily by bakeries, but rather by people in their homes. And this is not just in the past, it's also something that applies today. And I mean, if we start to think about why this is the case, because this is very different from many other parts of the world, I think that that's because bakeries, they need customers to sustain themselves. And as we said before, we have one customer each 375th meter. And I mean, there are definitely bakeries in the Nordics, and it's always been, but they're mostly located in the cities. And most of the larger cities in the Nordics, they will be located in the sort of southern third of Sweden, along the coasts mostly, in you know, a little area around Helsinki in Finland, and along the coast there as well, around Oslo, and a little bit on the western coast of Norway, and then the whole of Denmark. That's where you would have had bakeries, you know, plentiful bakeries that could have actually influenced food culture for real. And this, as you understand, doesn't really make up a particularly big part of the whole geographical area that makes up the Nordic region. And I actually did a little test some weeks ago when I did another lecture that wasn't about this at all. So I didn't influence the panel very much. And I asked them what they thought was the greatest baking culture in the whole world. None of them said Nordic. What do you guys think they said?
French.
Yes. So there was actually 99 people that said French, and one guy that said Austrian, which I thought was hysterically funny. And then I started thinking about this, and the fact is that before I started this research process and started making this book, I think that I would have also said French. And I started to really think about why this is. I mean, I think that this is simply a great example of a very clever and successful branding exercise carried out by the French. You visit France, you have a baguette, you have an eclair, and it will all be fantastic, you know? But if we start to look a bit more into what French baking culture actually looks like, it's like the polar opposite of the Nordic one. As opposed to ours, French baking culture is almost entirely driven by professional bakeries. And people in France, they don't bake that much at home. And I mean, why would they? There is a bakery in every little tiny village in France. And I mean, the country is densely and very evenly populated, so there are tiny little villages with little bakeries everywhere. And this means that the incentive to, you know, bake your own bread yourself as a daily carbohydrate staple in the past would have been very, very small. And then we can look even deeper into this, what that actually means for the culture of baking. And I imagine that a lot of people in this room, perhaps most of you, have been to France and you've eaten something from a French bakery. Perhaps you were there on vacation, perhaps you lived there for a while, perhaps you're even French, which might be a bit embarrassing in a while. I mean, most of us can probably agree that the French bakeries are lovely. I mean, the baguette, the croissant with butter, the pain au chocolat, apricot turnovers, flan, pain croissant. I mean, all of these are great and very delicious pastries and bakes. And I too love a French bakery. I mean, I used to live there, and I've been to many French bakeries, all over the country actually. And what it turns out to be, though, is that pretty much all of those bakeries, they have almost exactly the same repertoire. it looks remarkably similar from bakery to bakery, regardless of where in France it's located. In short, I mean, the butter outside of a bakery, or used to roll into the croissants in a bakery in Brittany, it'll be a little bit saltier than the butter used to roll into the croissants outside of Nice. And maybe the apricots in the south will be fresh, whilst those in the north will be canned. And there are definitely regional specialties and some regional variations to be added on to this sort of basic repertoire. But pretty much, French bakeries, and most bakeries in the world actually, deal with 15 to 20 standard things and the variations thereof on their menu. And this is not really a sign of a great cultural individuality and diversity. And I mean, this is simply because bakeries are businesses and they have to function financially. And businesses tend to function financially when you hit that sweet spot between what people want to buy and what's possible to produce in an efficient enough way. You know, when those sort of things cross, it sort of works. And I mean, as with all businesses, there are rules to play by, and there are many things, many factors that streamline the products. And I mean, you can compare, I mean, it's so easy when you talk about food that it becomes very romantic, and you think that, you know, food businesses don't play by the same rules, but they do. And you can compare bakeries to something different. Let's say car manufacturers. I mean, there's a whole bunch of car manufacturers. What do they all do? Well, except for some cosmetic differences largely. All of the car manufacturers, they make a rectangular box with a wheel in each corner that can go either in one direction or the other direction. And they do kind of the same thing. And it's exactly the same as with the bakeries. There are rules to play by, and there are businesses, and if they don't function, they disappear. And also, most bakeries are ran by bakers. And they've gone to school somewhere where someone taught them how to bake. And they learned pretty much the same stuff there as did all of the other bakers that also went to baking school. And when they've successfully ran their businesses for a number of years and they're going to teach a new generation of bakers how to bake, they're pretty much going to teach them the same stuff as they were told once, you know. Because that worked for them, right? And in baking cultures, because of this, baking cultures driven by bakeries, you will inevitably only have a fraction of diversity found in cultures driven by people baking at home. And this is another reason why there is no more diverse baking culture in the world than the Nordic. And I think that actually a comparison between the US and Sweden here really illustrates the difference in how much people bake at home. And during this book tour, I met a lot of people who enjoy baking, and I've spoken to a lot of home bakers especially. And I understand that here it's almost impossible to buy fresh yeast. You have to like go to a bakery, sneak in the back door and bake to buy some of their stash. It's a very black market, the whole thing. And in Sweden, for example, I mean, you can buy fresh yeast everywhere. You can buy it in every food store, every petrol station, every 7-Eleven. They will all carry fresh yeast. And that's obviously not for fun, just because they like the little yellow cubes. It's because people buy them and use them. And they use them to bake at home. And I mean, this is a huge factor in why Nordic baking culture is diverse. And then we can move on to geography and climate, another very important influence on what people eat. And as I said before, I mean, the Nordic region is a vast region. From the southernmost bits in Denmark to the furthest north you get, which is a group of islands north of Norway. From eastern Finland to western Greenland. I mean, it's a huge area of land. You could easily fit Europe a couple of times in there, and I mean, you could fit the US as well. And sure, a lot of this is ocean, but that doesn't really matter because, I mean, there are islands that are inhabited, and it's the geographical distance between the extremes where people live that creates the most obvious diversity. And in terms of climate, in this type of vast region, you will naturally have a lot of variation. And this in its turn, it means that what people have been able to grow in the past and thereby bake with and integrating into our culture has varied a lot, and that really influences what we do today. I mean, take wheat, for example, a grain which really only grows down sort of south in Scandinavia, southern third of Sweden, Denmark, and those little bits of Norway and Finland that I talked about before. Incidentally, actually almost exactly the same areas where most of the cities are, which is a fun little coincidence. Another coincidence with this is that this is also the part of the Nordics where you will find most of the wheat-based breads traditionally, because that's the grain that was predominant. And then you can go on and you can look at Denmark. So Denmark has the richest farming climates in all of the Nordics. Very fertile soils, humid summers, quite long summers, perfect for growing wheat. So they did that, and wheat has always been a very expensive trade commodity in Europe. So what they did is that they grew all this wheat, and then they sold it off to continental Europe, most of it at least. And on all of the poorer soils where they couldn't grow wheat, they instead grew rye. The rye, it ripened every single summer, and the rye was kept for the household to bake with. So in Denmark, in addition to those wheat breads, you'll also find a lot of pure rye breads. I mean, the iconic Danish rye loaf, for example. And this meant that, because it's very close to southern Sweden, you will, in both South Sweden and in Denmark, also find quite a lot of breads that have both wheat and rye in them. And they all come from that area. And then you can continue looking at Finland, for example. So Finland, it's too cool in the north to grow any wheat. And the south, which has inland climate, like the southeastern bits, the summer is a bit too short, and it's more importantly too dry for wheat. But rye can withstand quite a dry climate, and it grows faster than wheat, or ripens faster at least. So all over Finland, rye has been the predominant grain they bake with, which really shows on their baking culture. Where I come from, up north in Sweden, wheat can't grow because it's too cool. So people used to grow barley and oats. And oats has no gluten in it, barley has very little gluten in it, so you can't really make fluffy breads. So the further north you get in the Nordics, the flatter the breads. And at some point you hit like the sort of magic marker where they turn into flat breads. And we can once again make a little comparison to France, because it really illustrates what I'm talking about so well. What grains do we have in France? Wheat, 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 wheat everywhere. And why would you grow anything else? The whole country, pretty much, except for some really warm and dry bits in the sort of southeast. The whole country has perfect climate to grow wheat. And it's the most expensive of the cereal crops in historical times, so there was no motivation to grow anything else. And this really shows in that repertoire of things that you'll find in the French bakeries. They're all wheat-based. So, the climate and its limiting factors has historically created a lot of diversity. Instead of a single grain dominating a whole baking culture, in the Nordics, we have the 4 grains that have all been equally important to the population of a geographical part of the Nordic region. And obviously, this is another great reason to the diversity that you'll find in Nordic baking culture. We have 4 times as many different base products to work with. And as we saw before, the Nordic region is vast. But it's also a vast area located pretty much all in a marginal climate. And it's marginal in the sense that before mechanized transportation, you couldn't just move into the Nordics and live there without planning ahead. Because, there is a break in the vegetation season. Unlike, around the Mediterranean, or let's say Southeast Asia, or many other parts of the world where you would theoretically have access to fresh vegetable crops all year round. That was not the case in the Nordics. And this meant that people had to produce an excess of calories in summer so that they can use those in winter and live from them. And this applies to, all of the marginal climates in the whole world. And funnily enough, no matter where you are, there are the same two product groups that have become very, very dominant in the production of food in these marginal climates. And it's grains and dairy. And it doesn't matter if you're in the Peruvian Andes, or you're in Bhutan, you're in the Himalayas, or if you're in Sweden. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's corn or red rice or wheat, or if it's milk from a llama, yak, or cow, it's the same principle. And the reason for this is that both of these food groups are very easy to produce a lot of during the summer in excess, and they're also easy to prepare and store for the winter. I mean, with the milk, you can think cultured dairy products, cheese, all kinds of things like that to eat really well. Very dense in nutrition, doesn't take a lot of space to store either. Same with all of these cereal crops. I mean, the dried seeds of perennial grasses, whether it's corn or wheat, doesn't really matter, same principle. Easy to grow, easy to harvest, and very easy to store for the winter. And I mean, I think that baking, it's simply the kind of common name. It should be considered like the common name for what we do to these stored grains. Plain in most cases, but not rarely mixed with dairy products either. What we do to these things to make them more easy to eat, more easy to digest, more tasty, more varied. You know, that's what baking really is. And I think the fact that we created so much variation with such a limited range of base products as you do in baking compared to savory cooking is simply a great indicator as towards how big a part of the diet the grains has made up, and quite frankly still makes up in large parts of the world. People were simply very motivated to create variety in their diet, which they knew was going to consist largely of grains and dairy. And today, I mean, we often tell ourselves that we decide what we eat, that no one else dictates what products we buy and what we make from them. And this, I think, is completely wrong. I mean, we're animals, and we do exactly what our species has always done. We take the products that we have access to, and we prepare them in whatever way that makes sense to us there and then we eat them together with our flock or alone. That's what we do. And the thing that fascinates me so much with this is like the degree of cultural knowledge that's transmitted between generations. Because eating correctly grown, preserved, stored, and subsequently prepared foods made from grains and dairy, I mean, it used to be important for your survival in marginal climates. And survival is, as I'm sure you know, the single strongest motivating force of the human being. And for us today, eating, baked goods, breads, buns, cookies, biscuits, whatever, it rarely has to do with survival. It's mostly something we do for pleasure. And I mean, I thought a lot about why we find this so pleasurable. Both the act of preparing these foods and then eating them. I mean, the eating part, it can always be motivated by simple chemistry, that most baked goods are dense in energy, and we're sort of predisposed to like things that are dense in energy. But I don't think it's that simple, because that doesn't explain why it's so pleasurable to also bake. Because I think that most people actually take a greater pleasure in baking than you do in savory cooking. I mean, personally, it makes me more happy to bake a cake than it does to bake like an oven omelette, for example. And why would there be such a big difference in how we feel about this? I think this is just us being like pre-programmed not to waste very, very valuable and important information between generations. Our subconscious has made it, easier for us to make sure that the information on how to create a varied diet, basically from grains and dairy, that information is carried on to the next generation simply by making it so pleasurable that no one is going to want to be without it. And this sort of boils down to my final big reason to why the Nordic baking culture truly is the greatest around, the most diverse baking culture around. Nowhere else was it more important to master this sort of process of